I am doubly thrilled. I'm thrilled, first of all, to be speaking, as I always am, for Anthro Club, but for a joint meeting of Anthro and Math Club, which to me,
Love it.
yes, this is quintessentially what a university is. Absolutely. And we're fighting to hold on to it. We reach across our interdisciplinary boundaries. We learn from one another. And hopefully then good things happen. That's what an education's supposed to be about. And I'm thrilled to see how many people, you mathematicians really know how to turn out. So thanks for coming. It's great. Okay, so let me jump into today's lecture. All right. Graph theory and the stability of Middle East conflict. What comes after ISIS? I do want that up. Okay. Uh-oh. Projector. All right, my apologies. I should have hit that. Okay, so while that's waking up, I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to do this. It is an application of graph theory, major branch of mathematics. IPFW is very proud to have housed a number of outstanding graph theorists over the years. And that's right, in particular, Dr. Lowell Beinecke, who's the longest lived employee of IPFW, I believe. And still going strong and teaching us all. And so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to try to reach out as best as I can to our math colleagues and friends. I'm going to take a set, you might call it a vector of important math ideas. And I'm going to take another vector of important social science ideas, and we're going to take the dot product of the both and hopefully make a discovery here. We might get zero. Let's hope not. All right. And a little bit more background as to why I'm here to talk about this. Now, I've spoken for this forum before, and for the last 3+ years now, I've been doing a lot of research on ISIS. All different kinds of things, mostly looking at how they use language, but also applying things like graph theory to understand better what the configuration of competing and allied parties are doing in the Middle East and what the future is likely to hold. I've done this primarily for an office at the Pentagon called Strategic Multi-Layer Analysis Office. And it's a small office, but they bring together academics, people from think tanks, as well as government people to answer questions. We've done a lot of research over the years of different sorts of things. I've developed a very large database of ISIS language and things of that nature. But in the last year, what we've done is we've served as a reachback cell. I think their list of people, their mailing list, is about 1,000 experts around the world. And what we've been doing is we've been serving General Votel, the commander of U.S. Central Command, who he and his team, about monthly, every couple of months maybe, they send us questions of things that they want to know about so that they can understand the Middle East and this war against ISIS better. And literally, this office in the Pentagon just shoots it out to about 1,000 people, and anyone who's been doing research that could help to answer the question weighs in. We write reports, send them in, they get rolled up to Central Command. General Votel reads them, and then they do whatever they do. So that's what I've been engaged in. That's what led to today's talk. So ISIS, or as a lot of us refer to them, Daesh, it's going down. It has been going down hard for a while, despite what some politicians have suggested. And they are going to continue to go down as a physical entity. So asking the question posed in the title is certainly warranted. Just a few months ago in November, the red is the areas that they controlled in Syria and Iraq. And unfortunately, I don't have an equivalent CNN map. I got an equivalent map, but it's from another source, so it's a little hard to see perhaps what they've lost, but they've lost a lot. Half of the very large city, Mosul in Iraq, has been successfully retaken. The next half is about to fall, probably next week's. Couple months at the most, I would imagine. Once that happens, they'll be swept out of Iraq. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are 16 miles away from Raqqa, their capital in Syria, and so it's just a matter of time. So, yeah, they are going down. Most of their leadership has been killed. And astounding, when I did a version of this lecture in the fall, I made an estimate of probably about 75,000 Daesh fighters have died, and recently the Pentagon came out and said, yeah, we think it's about 75,000. That's out of about 90 that have ever participated. So that's just an astounding death rate and everything. Now 15,000 left is still a lot. They can still create a lot of mischief, obviously. It's still a large organization, but they're clearly on the outs. And so before I jump into the math and all that fun stuff, I wanted to recommend very highly, actually request that you go out and read an article. Back in September, I think it was, General Votel asked us the question, what is the virtual caliphate? And a number of us were doing research that was relevant to that, and we did our reports, sent them to him. He's got a lot of very smart people on his staff. Evidently, he's pretty smart because he was already thinking along these lines. And he published an article. Let me see if I can bring it up very quickly. And there's a bipartisan think tank called CNAS, and it's an excellent article. I'm going to ask that you go and read it. How do I do this here? There we go. Entitled #Virtual Caliphate, because this is likely where Daesh is going. A lot more of these guys are going to get killed and all that kind of stuff. Probably the principals will get killed, but there will be others that will continue on. And Daesh has done something much more thoroughly and much better than any other jihadist organization, and that is go to the internet and have an internet presence. And their videos and their rhetoric and the things they put out are very slick, very compelling to people who don't think critically or don't know much about Islam, and they will continue to be very persuasive. And so this will be a persistent problem. Back in May, before someone killed Adnani, one of their main spokespersons, he released a big speech in which he basically said, we're going to go virtual, because they already saw that things were going to go very badly for them on the ground. And then as recently as November, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called caliph of the Islamic State, he likewise put out a major statement. Just I think a week ago or 2 weeks ago, he put out more indications that it's time to hang it up on the ground. We're all dying, but we're going to live on in cyberspace. And I wanted to point one of the things that I actually prepared by way of answering General Votel's question. Oh, so if you just Google Votel Virtual Caliphate, it'll take you right to that website. It is well worth the reading, because there's a chance a year from now something bad's going to happen someplace, and its origin will be from the internet, from people self-radicalizing, and all of a sudden people are going to be reporting that, oh my goodness, we're blindsided by this virtual caliphate. Where did it come from? And I just want you to know we're on it now. I mean, people are thinking about this and anticipating it now. And it's an excellent, excellent article. I can't recommend it highly enough. So, all right, back to the slides then. So they're going down, and the Middle East is undergoing really catastrophic changes we're all seeing in the news. But let's do some graph theory. So where does graph theory come from? It comes from the brains of mathematicians. In particular, Leonhard Euler, 1736, publishes or deals with a thing called the 7 Bridges of Königsberg problem. And there's this city, Königsberg, in Europe, and it's got some rivers that go through it, and there's 7 bridges. And the question is, can a person walk through the city by crossing each bridge once and only once? And it turns out to be a problem in graph theory. There's nodes little dots, the bridges. There's, or I guess, links to different parts that you want to go to and everything. And this is basically a graph. And so Euler does his mathematical analysis and says, no, you can't do it. And this gives birth to the field of graph theory. Now, who really cares? I mean, mathematicians, I mean, really, they're all off in their own little math brains, right? And whatnot, and they just think things like this, totally abstract. Doesn't give anyone a job at the end of the day, and whatnot. But you cannot live without graphs. The spread of sexually transmitted diseases is modeled with graph theory, very powerfully so, and has led to more effective interventions in preventing things like AIDS. Cell towers, your cell phones that we can't live without, don't work. Because what are cell towers? They're a bunch of nodes that are then connected with arcs, and that's a graph. And graph theory is used to figure out how to make that work so you can be sexting to people, like Dr. Druin in psychology will tell us. That's something she studies. Terror networks. They are organized as graphs. This is actually the co-conspirators for 9/11. I took the data from this graph and was able to retrodict actually, who was willing to get on the planes to kill themselves. And believe it or not, their position in a graph helped us to understand that. And so many other things, whether it's social media, your network of friends that you know face to face, your professional networks, it goes on and on. Your life is graphs. It truly is. You live graphs every day of your life. And those abstract thoughts that people like Euler had over 250 years ago led to the math that makes all of this work. So there's an element of graph theory called balance theory that I want to talk about next. It's an application. Let's say you've got, well, let me back up a little bit. We all have dyadic relationships with one another. Okay, so Dr. Klein and I know one another. We've got a relationship. But you don't really have a social organization or structure until you can go beyond that. We're not just a bunch of one-off dual relationships. But if Dr. Thompson, Dr. Klein, and myself know one another, and I've got a relationship with you, you've got a relationship with him, he's got a relationship with me, now we can talk about social organization and structure. And so what I've done up here is actually portrayed what the three of us would be. We're a circle of friends. We all have positive relationships. And so you can multiply the sign of each of these links. And if it comes out positive, we can say that's a transitive triad. And transitive triads are stable. It's an amazing thing in nature. When we're talking about humans, it seems to be something in human psychology. We like that. And it's not just that we're friends, because we don't need to be friends to have a stable relationship. So if I'm A, Dr. Klein might not like me, and I know Dr. Thompson doesn't like me, okay? So they both know that I'm their enemy, and that's all they need to know to be friends. And so if you multiply a negative times a positive times a negative, you get a positive. That is also a stable relationship. We could go on forever, just you guys hating on me. We experience these things in our own personal lives. Let's say you've got two friends. Let's say you're married or in a relationship, and things are going well between them. That's the two at the bottom, and you're at the top. So you go over, you have, lunch at their house, everything's cool, until they split up. That's intransitive. Positive times negative is a negative. Psychologically, that wigs us out. We don't like that, and it will not last. And eventually, you'll lose a friend in these situations, right? You've got to choose sides, and then you revert then to enemy of my enemy is my friend type relationship. And psychologically, we're content with that, and that can go on forever. So this was first realized in 1946. It's a famous article published by a social psychologist. And then in the mid-50s, mathematicians, Cartwright in particular, actually started doing mathematical proofs of it and social network analysis really takes off. So balance theory applies in so many things. It applies to relationships between chimpanzees, ponies, birds, rock hyraxes. And I have it on good authority that the rock hyrax is not ugly, but rather is a cute animal. And it scales. We can use balance theory to understand our interpersonal relationships. We can understand our relationships in our small groups of friends. We can understand our professional networks, and it even scales up to the level of nation states. This set of graphs here shows how there's a juxtaposition of European powers from 1870 to 1908, I think it was. And finally, in 1908, they worked it out. They finally had transitive relationships, which pitted one half of Europe against the other half, which then led to World War I. So this stuff is applicable all over the place. So let's talk about what would be ideal if we're going to apply graph theory to understanding these things. Ideally, we would have a graph called a directed graph or digraph in which we can say what the direction of relationships would be. So let's say I reach out to Dean Link, but he doesn't reach back, okay? Well, we've got a relationship, but it's only going one way, okay? That's a digraph. There's 16 types of triads you can have if we consider the direction of the relationship. There's a standard naming convention called the Mann naming convention. So the first one says how many mutual dyads there are. The next one is how many asymmetrical unidirectional ones. And the last one are null ones. Like, you don't have to have a relationship, okay? So you can take the counts of all of these different types of triads and put them in a vector. Because you can do that, you can start taking linear combinations of the vector and calculating things like means and standard deviations and do all kinds of inferential statistics to them. So math can be very powerful in this. So it's now time for a bad joke. So an engineer, a mathematician, and a physicist go to the races. After the race, the engineer can't understand why he lost all the money. Because he measured the horses, he had their strengths, and all the mechanical things that physicists do, or engineers do. The physicist interrupts and says, yeah, but you didn't look at the individual variations and all that kind of stuff, so I bet probabilistically on the ones that would do better. And then the mathematician sits there with a big smirk on his face and a fat wallet. And he says, well, first I assumed all the horses were identical and spherical. And he went from there. There's many versions of that joke, right? But yeah, math can be very powerful. But I am not a mathematician. I am an empirical scientist, which means I've got to deal with the messy world, and it doesn't always cooperate fully. So we weren't able to do digraphs and all the stuff that we'd want to do for this Middle Eastern network. So we had to simplify things. I want to tell you how we simplified it. We focused only on 5 kinds of triads, and these are triads where we didn't even bother with directionality or asymmetry, just because we could tell for some groups, other groups we couldn't, and it was just not going to be very sound analysis. We substituted null relationships for negative ones so that we could do some of the math. And then we had truly null, and I'll illustrate this in a couple minutes. Here's a way of illustrating it with some actual triads. So you've got Iran, Assad, and Hezbollah. They are all more or less, they do have tensions, but more or less they're allies, certainly in the security realm in this fight. So you've got a circle of friends that's stable. We expect that to be stable. You've got an awful lot of enemy of my friends going on. And so Iran and the Shia Iraqis and the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, they're allied. And they both don't like the Sunnis in Iraq. And that can go on for a long time. You've got unstable relationships. And so, for instance, the government of Iraq is, at this time, trying to have a positive relationship with both the Sunni tribes in Iraq and the Shia in Iraq. But the Shia and the Sunni pretty much hate each other a whole lot, and so that's not working out that well, and we would predict that in time. That's going to resolve some way because it just really cannot continue on like this. And you've got a lot of circles of hate. Al-Nusra is the former Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria and Iraq, and really Syria. They actually had a major policy shift recently, and they are no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda. But they still hate ISIS a whole lot. And they hate Assad a whole lot, and Assad hates them, and he hates ISIS, and they're all just hating on one another. So these are the sorts of relationships that we pluck out. We've got 24 key actors. These are 24 states or non-state groups, so some of these terrorist groups and insurgent groups that we're talking about. And depending on the exact analysis that we've done, we're usually dealing with about 1,200 different triadic relationships that we're trying to analyze. And what we do is we do a census to figure out how many transitive relationships do we have, how many are all friendly, how many are circles of hate, et cetera, et cetera. So here are the data inputs. First of all, I need to do a shout out to a colleague of mine. She's a political scientist who works for a private firm, but she does a lot of research for the government, and she's a colleague of mine, Dr. Alison Astorino-Courtois. And she came up with a scheme to classify the different conflicts that are happening in the Middle East. And she focused on 5 key interests that every group has. So one is just their security interests, right? Who's trying to kill us? Who are we trying to kill? All that kind of stuff. Economic interests. Those two do not necessarily go hand in hand. Prestige. Most of the groups are looking for a way to look good and have prestige on the international stage. Their identity. Some of these groups are Shia Muslim groups. Some are Sunni Muslim groups. Some are Iraqi groups. Some identify as Syrian groups. So identity is an important thing, and sometimes identities complement one another. Sometimes they conflict. And then, this is the last one, how their relationship plays with another group can have implications for their own domestic base. Okay, so if you're a Sunni tribal leader and you come home announcing to your people that, guess what, I've got a new friend and he's a Shia Muslim from southern Iraq, you've probably just lost your base because they're not going to like that. Okay, so we ask these questions for all of the dyads. Does a relationship between two groups improve or detract from their security, or is there no relationship? Or is it ambiguous? There's a lot of ambiguity, as you're going to see soon. And so on and so forth for economic, prestige, identity, and domestic. How do we know this? I've done a lot of analysis of speeches that all of these groups have done. It's actually a quantitative analysis, so I can come up with actual measures of how strongly they feel about one another. So we drew on that. We also drew on just the actions, what these groups are doing with one another. Like, if one suicide bombs another, we take that as a negative security relationship. And then some of them are inferred. And so, for instance, there's 2 local jihadist groups in Syria. They're not waging a global jihad. They just are waging a holy war against Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. They both hate Assad. They're both jihadist groups, so we assume they've got the same basic identity. But their security relationship vis-a-vis one another is uncertain because they are different groups. They're competing for different market share of fighters, and they're actually in competition at that level. And so there we kind of infer what that relationship should be. And as I mentioned before, we measure their interests as whether or not they're positive, negative, ambiguous, which we use as 0, or blank, they're null. Like, not everyone has a connection. And then we aggregate these up to figure out where the common interests or disinterests lie in this network of 24 different groups in the Middle East. I'll illustrate it on this slide here. So with respect to security concerns, you can have that enemy of my enemy is my friend relationship, and that's illustrated in this matrix up here. So A has a negative relationship with B and C. B and C have a positive relationship with one another. But then we layer onto that their economic relationship. And let's say A and C actually have something to gain from one another, even though they're in conflict. Here's a concrete example of that on the ground. So as if you're following the news, you know that the Kurds hate ISIS. ISIS hates the Kurds. But for a while, ISIS was getting some oil and needed to sell it. Guess who they sold it to go on the black market? The Kurds. Okay? So, so once again, the security concerns and economic concerns do not necessarily go hand in hand. So in a case like that, that kind of nullifies or it makes ambiguous just what the relationship is with one another. You layer an identity thing on, and once again, it can become more and more ambiguous. And so what we do is we basically go through all of the concerns and figure out where they truly have common concerns, either negative or positive, and otherwise count the rest ambiguous. And we get graphs like this, which are starting to look kind of sparse. And then we get matrices like this. This is part of a security matrix. And this just shows the dyads. So here's, let's see. All right, so Daesh, that's ISIS, hates Ahrar al-Sham, and they hate Jaish, the other local jihadist organization. I mentioned earlier, Jaish and Ahrar have an ambiguous relationship because they kind of have the same mission, but they're different groups and they're competing with one another. And that's how we kind of figure out what the triads are. It just takes a relatively straightforward algorithm to walk its way through the matrix and build all the triads. And so a private firm that's actually working on some of this stuff kindly donated the hours of one of their programmers who wrote me a little Python program to do this so I don't have to painstakingly waste hours and weeks of my time trying to do it myself and make mistakes. So that we have, and they gave me the program, but I don't program in Python. So fortunately, we're going to hit all the disciplines in arts and sciences today, or at least we're going to try to. My daughter happens to be a biology grad student here at IPFW, and she does program in Python, and so she kindly has run the analyses for me. So, all right. Here are some estimates of the transitivity of this Middle Eastern network. So I'll go right to, first of all, focus on the current. This is the current situation as best we can tell. And the first two columns deal with what we know to be the case. There's a lot of things that we're uncertain about, and we'll get to those later. But for the relationships that we really know about, 63% of them are transitive. This is a relatively stable system. Hundreds and hundreds of social systems have been analyzed since the late 60s. There's a huge body of literature on it. And a system that has this much transitivity is pretty darn stable. It's not going to change that much, no matter what you do to it. Here's the sad, weepy part. Only 10% of those are peaceful triads, those circles of friends. In other words, the majority of relationships that we can really identify are enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we can expect a lot of ongoing conflict. The conflict might not necessarily take place as violence, although given the fact that pretty much every adult male and adolescent male in this region is walking around with an AK-47, I would predict that there probably will be continued violence even after Daesh has been eliminated in its current form. But the last column is all of those ambiguous triads, and the strong majority are ambiguous. So things could really shift a lot one way or another, depending on all of these little micro negotiations that will eventually happen between the different groups. It's going to be very hard to predict the direction of the configuration of these groups in the Middle East in the days, months, and years to come. So yeah, our ambiguity is very high. And look at what happens when we get rid of Daesh. It becomes more transitive, hardly more peaceful though. okay? There are such underlying enmities and rivalries among these groups that have basically what happened is after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and then after the Arab Spring hit Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Pandora's box is opened. And all this stuff now is out, and people are in literally existential fights over access to resources, even to their very physical existence. It's a thing that as Americans we can't really relate to. We're afraid of a terrorist attack that would tragically kill 50 people, right? And we hate it, and we should hate it. But we're not worried that someone's going to come over the hill, wipe out all of the men and boys, and sell the women into sexual slavery. Those are the level of concerns, and they're real concerns, that many of these smaller groups have in the Middle East. So when you're dealing with things like that, it's going to be hard to dislodge people out of these patterns, and it's going to take some real leadership by someone to help bring that about. And notice also, getting rid of Daesh makes things even more ambiguous, because there's at least one thing that everyone in the Middle East can agree on. They all hate Daesh. They all want to eliminate these people, and it's just taken them a while to get their act together to do it. But you take them off the table, and now all those ambiguities really become even more apparent. So, and in terms of the violence versus conflict, I'm going to make this prediction. I've made it before, and we'll see how it goes. There is a lot of potential for continued violent conflict. But Daesh has been unique as an organization and as a movement in a couple of ways. And one of the ways is it's in their unique dedication to violence. Even Al-Qaeda is not dedicated to violence the same way that Daesh is. For Al-Qaeda, violence is still instrumental. You do violent things to get people to do stuff, to get your way. For Daesh, part of the kind of religious ideology that they developed, which is quite unique unto themselves and not shared by anyone else, is that violence in and of itself is a sacred act. It's necessary. So taking them off the boards is probably going to hopefully decrease the level of violence. But the continued enmities and distrust and competitions over resources, desire for revenge among the remaining groups is probably going to continue a fair amount of violence, I would predict. A note about Assad. I did earlier analyses of what happens if we get rid of Assad. I think that's not even worth asking anymore. He's there to stay. But a couple years ago, that was, and up until recently, and probably continued, that's official U.S. policy. But just for the record, when you take him out, not much changes anyway. Okay, this is a very stable system. So there's no game changers, no simple solutions. And this is something that our leaders in other countries, leaders in international organizations need to fully comprehend the complexities of the conflict in this region. And simple pronouncements of whatever are not going to work. It's just not going to work. There are things we can do, for sure, but it's going to be a long slog, and it's going to be messy, and there's no one thing that's going to fix this Humpty Dumpty that's fallen. So I've gone for 40 minutes. I had a few other slides that talk about kind of the U.S.'s position in this. Maybe I'll just do them very quickly. If you look at the net all interests, you'll notice that we're somewhere in the middle in terms of being moderately negatively viewed by these different groups overall. Other groups, once again, Daesh is always on the bottom. Pretty much everyone hates them. This is an interesting one. To the extent that you can separate out different interests, the U.S. actually has the highest level of credibility with anyone when it comes to addressing security concerns. So one of the kind of old roles that the U.S. played in the Middle East was as broker of peace. And there actually still is potential for that, if our nation chose to assume that role and deal with all the challenges that has. However, very recently, about a couple weeks ago, Russia hosted a Syrian peace conference in Kazakhstan. And so the Russians are moving into that role. They still don't have the level of credibility that we do in the region, but they are working very hard at supplanting us from that role in the region. So a few months from now, we may have to refigure, literally, the relationships that we're working with. And if you take Daesh away, that doesn't change a whole lot. So I think that gives just a little more insight as to where the U.S. may in the future fall in its role in the Middle East if we choose to have one. And so to sum up, there's some strategic applications of this. Just understanding what we're dealing with in the Middle East is something that people in government and planners need to comprehend, so they have some sense of where it's likely to go or where it's not likely to go. And on a tactical level, once we understand where those ambiguous relationships are, if we want to foment peace, let's say, between two groups, now we know what their issues are to try to affect that change. And then once we have affected that change, or let's say if we affect that change, we can start making predictions as to what that's going to do to the system overall. You know, is it going to have the desired overall effect? So I think there's some more tactical, on-the-ground sorts of applications that this kind of mathematical analysis affords us that we can't get in any other way. And I think with that, I'm done. And hopefully the dot product came together, the scalar's not zero, and we've got something to talk about. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
You put up a matrix of numerical values from triads. Do you just work with it that way, or is there some summary analysis of the overall matrix, numerical?
Yeah, the inventory of triads that I presented there, that's the basic analysis. And so for the whole system, you can sum that up throughout the whole system. Another thing that we've done, I didn't present here, is we'll look at every individual group and look at how transitive or intransitive its relationships are with its own triads. And that gives us further insight as to which groups might be more fluid and their relationships more likely to change as opposed to other groups that are really entrenched. Like Daesh, that's a trivial example because all but one group hates them. So they're thoroughly entrenched. Their relationships aren't changing until they're eliminated. But we can get further insights that way. Now, if we had a full digraph and we could do the full analysis that graph theory affords, you can do some really interesting things. So you can ask questions. Is this matrix, is this graph, I should say, more or less likely to occur by chance? You know, we can ask questions about how structured it is and therefore how likely it is to change. But at this point in time, we don't have that level of fidelity in the data. Yeah.
What are your findings suggest about multiculturalism in America and Europe?
Wow, that's a big question. Okay, the next application that we're planning is in a separate project that we happen to be doing for Special Operations Command. We're looking at Eurasia, you know, relationship of Russia and European nations, everything like that. That's where we actually think we can have better data so as to create real digraphs and do the more full-blown analysis. And that's what we're planning. So come back later. But yeah, it's very, I would predict that in Europe, for the most part, it's going to be more transitive and more peaceful. But this is the concern that a lot of people in international affairs have, is if Putin is successful in breaking apart things like the European Union and whatnot, and with respect to ethnicity, we're seeing the rise of hard right groups and everything that would like to see that, the Brexit and all that kind of stuff, then maybe all of a sudden that system shifts into one that's much more fluid. And we're actually going to look at that. One of my little side projects when we started doing the Eurasian stuff a couple of years ago is Putin kept on talking about these awful neo-Nazis everywhere. It's like, is he making this up? So I started looking into it, and there's a lot of neo-Nazi groups, and they all have like their favorite neo-pagan death metal music. And so I started listening to it and got hooked. And so I've got quite a library now of neo-pagan death metal music and everything. But it's an interesting manifestation of the rise of these kind of separatist, nationalistic groups and everything. And if they continue to rise, if someone like Putin can, incidentally, Putin also is funding some of these groups. So he hates them because they're Nazis. You know, the Russians have a problem with Nazis, a little history there. But he's funding them in places like France because they're destabilizing France's democracy. Yeah. Hey, Mike.
Yeah, so in this network analysis, kind of, you know, some of the structural equivalence and weak tie stuff fits in, I assume, with the ambiguity. And so the structural failures in the Middle East allowed Daesh to move in. And that's probably, I'm going to ask you, I mean, this is the favorable position in the U.S. because we have so many kind of weak connections and we're ambiguous with Iran, with everybody, with Turkey and everything else. So we're in a favored position like that. So is that going to forestall what you said, maybe Russia moving? Because they are not ambiguous with anybody. They have very, you know, pretty strong negative or positive relationship. So are we still favored structurally, you know?
At this time we are, but Russia is reaching out to Saudi Arabia. Russia is reaching out to government of Iraq, and they are starting to soften those negatives, and they're working hard at it. And we suspect that this is a plan. Putin is smart and adept at this kind of politicking. And so that's why I said we may be refiguring some of our connections. Even months from now, I could see us doing that. And that would change our position entirely. And I think he wants to do that.
At a policy level, our record doesn't seem to be particularly good when we're in the business of taking someone out at the leadership level. You mentioned earlier that Assad is here to stay. And I guess my question would be, why would we even be in the game of trying to take him out?
We've been asking that question for 3 years. And, you know, it's something that, you know, this really pertains to post-Arab Spring. So especially in the State Department, they decided, and of course, President Obama backed it, that Assad must go. We did our first study of the Middle East with special reference to Assad and his position, the rhetoric he uses, what it says about his resolve and everything. And we tried to get it to State Department before Geneva II. We didn't, because one of the team members from a university, not ours, got it in late. And so it got in there the day that the negotiation started. We had a set of recommendations of what not to do. The top recommendation was do not directly threaten Assad's hold on power. Not that we were saying he should stay in power or not, just that was going to be a non-starter and was going to screw the pooch on the negotiation. The very first words out of Secretary of State Kerry's mouth was, Assad must go, at that conference. And we just groaned. I could hear people from Fort Wayne. I could hear the groan from D.C. as the words came out of his mouth. Yeah, oh, sorry. Gusto, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, how do you define the system you refer to? Because depending on this definition, future scenarios may change. So is it an open system, closed, self-referent? So how do you view the nature of the system?
Yeah, this is a great question, because this is always a problem with any social network analysis, any application of graph theory is where do you draw the boundaries of your system? And for virtually any realistic system, that's always going to be arbitrary. So we talked about it a lot. And part of what entered it is, okay, how many of these groups are really interacting a lot? Do we have a lot of, if you will, hits between them, positive or negative? And then the other thing was simple tractability. What can we handle in the time? And so we made a compromise. It's a good question. Speaks to boundedness, right, math folks?
It's a kind of related question. Is the U.S. presidential election, what happened afterward, is there any indication that that's going to mess with your graphs?
I don't know. So, you know, you saw that positive position of the U.S. with regard to security. I can't believe we're still regarded that positively. We are, and indeed, many in the region don't regard us so positively. I think I mentioned this in the fall when I was talking about it, but it's worth mentioning again. We had like 100 or 300 experts in Syria and Iraq. at universities and everything. And of course, they are very critical of U.S. policy. When Special Operations Command reached out to them and said, hey, we're studying this, we'd like to understand it better, 100% of them got back. Isn't that amazing? So people were willing still to work with even our government, even our military, which really, military is not the problem, it's the civilian leadership that makes these decisions, but still willing to participate. Whether or not like the ban and stuff like that is going to impact that, I don't know. It's not going to help. Yeah.
Is there any rhyme or reason that you with those 7 countries that were?
Yeah, there was a precedent for it because in the Obama administration, these were the countries that are so racked with civil war that they are not well governed, and so therefore there's more of a possibility of them serving as a safe haven for terrorists to operate. So it's a potential that they're looking at, and I think that's reasonable. But then as other people have pointed out, not a single terrorist involved in 9/11, for instance, was from any of them, and any ISIS-inspired terror attacks that have occurred here at home didn't, involve any immigrants or anything like that. So that's then a reason to doubt whether or not that's going to be effective. Yeah.
Just a question kind of about the level of ambiguity. Mm-hmm. So how many of those relationships were influenced either positively or negatively by ambiguity, just ballpark percentage, if you said over half of them or fewer than that, or how many of them were influenced by that one link being ambiguous?
Yeah, ultimately it was around 70%. So there's a lot of ways individual groups can go with regard to one another. And that's the thing, I don't think we do this as much as we used to as a nation, is have foreign service officers from state or military has theirs, actually constantly engaged with different groups. But this is the stuff those people would need to know. It's like, okay, here's the 4 things, here's where they hate each other, here's where they like each other, here's where they're not sure, and then you start working those things, right? So this is like the baseline information a person needs to work with. There was a time when we had more people on the ground, and that's one of the shifts that's occurred in the past like 30 years or so in government, is to have fewer and fewer of those people with the hopes that we can somehow remotely do it through internet, social media, whatever.
Yeah, because having been employed there, we never got that kind of intel. Mm-hmm. We never had, just like real general, specific or non-specific cultural things to avoid, basically.
Yeah.
Not real specific intel on different groups or people that we would interact with.
Yeah, the people that we mostly, if you will, who are our customers are almost always people in special operations units, and they're the people that are more likely to engage at that level, and they love it. Anything they can get, they just love it, and so it's always rewarding to work for them.
I got one more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, an ambiguous policy by the United States, as we've had. Mm-hmm. So, Assad must go, but we're not going to do anything about it. I mean, this favors a placement for the U.S., actually, because we're not enemies with Iran right now. I mean, we're about to be. We're not, we have no, like, the negative on all of these isn't popping out. So it's actually a favored place for your model, isn't it? I mean.
Yeah. Now, that particular thing, I think drawing lines in the sand and then not acting is probably generally not a good way of being ambiguous. But in general, I think you're right. And speaking of like this special ops type people, it's one time we almost got funding to do a study of like really elite Navy SEALs. And the Navy SEAL captain who wanted this done said, they can train a person physically for anything, but what they found was the real key thing as to who could be successful are those that can, I think he put it this way, jump into a sea of chaos and deal with it and deal with those uncertainties and everything. And that's the kind of leadership, I would argue, that we need if we're going to be engaged in these parts of the world. Yeah, ambiguity is not necessarily a bad thing. That's where you can start working deals. Even contradictions between groups are not bad, because let's say you've got a group that has economic interests that are positive, security interests that are negative. Guess what? Now you have something that you as a political scientist would appreciate, trade-offs, right? But it takes the personnel in place to do it, and then the right kind of people who can think through complex problems like that. That's what we need. And I am going to make the plug for, fundamentally, that's the purpose of having general education and the development of critical thinking skills. And I don't mean that to be a cheesy plug for what we do at a university, but that sums it up right there. That's the skill that it takes to deal with the world as it really is. Well, you know, thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to have so many people here, thrilled to have math and anthropology and some other disciplines coming together. It's been a great time for me. Thank you.